Tonight we're diving into dangerous territory, the kind of psychological archaeology that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. We're talking about projection, energy vampirism, and that uncomfortable moment when you realize your brain has been your own worst roommate for decades, collecting evidence against people who smile at you, while their unconscious minds are busy writing your psychological obituary. You know that feeling when someone congratulates you on your success, but your nervous system starts preparing for psychological warfare. When everything looks peaceful on the surface, but your soul feels like it's slowly being drained by a Wi-Fi connection you never consented to join. Tonight, we're going to explore why your intuition keeps sending you amber alerts about people who seem perfectly nice, and why ignoring these signals is like dismissing your emotional smoke detector because you don't want to deal with the fire that's been burning in the basement for years. This is for those of you lying awake at 3 a.m., wondering why you feel exhausted after every family gathering, why certain friendships feel like low-level psychological warfare, and why your attempts at setting boundaries are met with the kind of resistance usually reserved for hostile takeovers. It's for the empaths who've been gaslit into believing their sensitivity is a character flaw, the overthinkers who've been told they're paranoid for noticing what everyone else pretends not to. See? And the highly intuitive individuals who've learned to apologize for their perceptions. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, particularly those of you joining us from the darker hours when the psychological defenses are down and the truth becomes impossible to ignore. Dim the lights. Adjust the volume to something that feels like a whisper meant only for you, and prepare to enter a space where your psychological defenses can finally take a break. Make sure your ego is in airplane mode, because we're about to explore territory that it definitely doesn't want to acknowledge. You're no longer in your bedroom. You're inside the mind of someone who's learned that the most dangerous poison comes in the prettiest bottles, served with the warmest smiles and the most convincing declarations of love. The good news is that your unconscious mind has been keeping detailed files on everyone around you, cataloging every micro-expression, every energetic shift, every moment when someone's words didn't match their underlying emotional signature. The bad news? It filed them under, ignore this or you'll hurt people's feelings. And now you're wondering why you feel like you're drowning in relationships that look perfectly healthy from the outside. This video is for those of you who are tired of gaslighting yourselves into believing that feeling drained around certain people is somehow your fault. It's for those who've spent years wondering why your body tenses up around individuals who've never technically done anything wrong, who've learned to distrust their own perceptions because everyone keeps insisting that their discomfort is evidence of their own dysfunction rather than a reasonable response to an unreasonable situation. Carl Jung once said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." But tonight, we're going to explore the flip side of that wisdom, understanding when what irritates others about you becomes the hidden hatred that poisons your environment, and how to recognize when you're being psychologically undermined by people who would swear on their grandmother's grave that they only want the best for you, even as their unconscious minds are broadcasting resentment on frequencies that your nervous system can't help but receive. We're going to examine the silent poison that seeps through relationships, the atmospheric toxicity that accumulates in families and social circles, and the particular kind of psychological warfare that operates through apparent care, concern, and love. We're going to talk about how to trust your body's intelligence when your mind has been trained to override it, how to distinguish between your own emotions and the emotions you're absorbing from others, and how to maintain your psychological sovereignty in environments that are subtly hostile to your thriving. There's an invisible exhaustion that settles into your bones when you're surrounded by people who smile with their mouths, but wound with their frequencies. It's the kind of tiredness that 8 hours of sleep can't fix, because it's not your body that's exhausted. It's your soul trying to maintain its integrity in an environment that's subtly hostile to your very existence. It's like being slowly poisoned by radiation you can't see, from a source everyone insists doesn't exist. Most people think conflict is loud, They imagine hatred as dramatic confrontations, raised voices, and slammed doors. But the most insidious form of psychological warfare happens in the silence between words, in the micro-expressions that flash across faces for milliseconds, in the energy that shifts when you walk into a room and suddenly everyone's laughter feels forced hollow, like a performance being put on for your benefit, while the real emotional truth operates on a completely different frequency. This is what Jung called the collective shadow, the parts of human nature that we've all agreed to pretend don't exist, even as they run the show from behind the curtain of social acceptability. When someone harbors unconscious resentment toward you, their energy becomes like a radio station broadcasting on a frequency of subtle hostility. Your nervous system picks up the signal, even when your rational mind insists everything is fine, creating a constant state of low-level psychological alert that leaves you feeling drained, anxious, and vaguely unsafe in situations that should be comfortable. Think about the last time you felt inexplicably anxious around someone who was being perfectly pleasant. Your logical brain probably told you that you were being paranoid, oversensitive, or dramatic. But your body was reading data that your mind was trained to ignore. The micro-tensions in their facial muscles, the slightly delayed responses that suggested internal calculation rather than genuine engagement, the way their energy felt like. It was pushing against yours rather than flowing with it, creating a kind of psychological friction that accumulated in your nervous system over time. The human nervous system is exquisitely designed to detect threats, evolved over millions of years to keep our ancestors alive in environments where missing subtle signs of danger could mean death. But we've been socialized to override these ancient warning systems in favor of social politeness, rational analysis, and the exhausting work of giving everyone the benefit of the doubt, even when our bodies are screaming that something is wrong. This override creates a particular kind of modern suffering. We've learned to apologize for our intuition, to doubt our perceptions, and to prioritize others' comfort over our own psychological safety. We've been trained to believe that if we can't rationally explain why someone makes us uncomfortable, then our discomfort is invalid, unreasonable, or evidence of our own psychological dysfunction. This is how we end up in situations where we're slowly being poisoned by proximity to people whose unconscious minds have declared war on our existence, even as their conscious minds maintain plausible deniability through surface-level pleasantness. It's like being attacked by someone wearing a smile mask. The assault is real, but the weapon is invisible, making it almost impossible to defend against or even acknowledge. Consider the metaphor of a plant trying to grow in contaminated soil. No matter how much sunlight it receives, no matter how carefully it's watered, no matter how perfect the external conditions appear to be, it will struggle to thrive because the very foundation of its existence is toxic. The plant doesn't understand why it's failing. It only knows that its energy is being drained, its growth is stunted, and its natural vitality is slowly being compromised by something it can't see or understand. This is what happens when you're trying to build a life while surrounded by people whose hidden resentments create an environment hostile to your growth. You start to wither in ways that you can't explain. Your confidence erodes gradually. Your natural enthusiasm becomes tempered by an inexplicable caution. Your trust in your own perceptions begins to deteriorate as you're repeatedly told that your discomfort is evidence of your own oversensitivity rather than a reasonable response to subtle psychological aggression. The absence of overt conflict doesn't equal harmony. Sometimes the most peaceful-looking situations are the most psychologically dangerous because they lull you into letting your guard down while subtle forms of sabotage continue unchecked. The person who never argues with you, but somehow always manages to undermine your confidence through carefully timed questions about your decisions. The family member who supports your dreams in words, but whose energy feels like quicksand every time you try to move forward. The friend who celebrates your successes, but whose congratulations feel like they're being delivered through gritted teeth, accompanied by an undertone that suggests your achievement is somehow problematic or undeserved. These relationships create what we might call atmospheric toxicity, a constant low-level psychological pollution that accumulates in your system over time. You start to feel tired for no reason, anxious in situations that should be comfortable, and doubtful about perceptions that your deeper wisdom knows are accurate. You begin to question your own reality, because the dissonance between what you're experiencing and what you're supposed to be experiencing becomes too uncomfortable to hold. Your nervous system starts operating in a constant state of hypervigilance, scanning for threats that everyone insists don't exist. You become tired not from any single dramatic event, but from the accumulated weight of having to maintain your psychological equilibrium in an environment that's subtly working against it. It's like trying to sleep in a room where the carbon monoxide alarm keeps going off, but everyone insists the air is fine and suggests that maybe you should have your hearing checked. The cruelest part of this dynamic is how it trains you to distrust your own perceptions. When you're surrounded by people whose hidden hostility creates an undertone of psychological discomfort, but who maintain plausible deniability through surface-level pleasantness, you learn to invalidate your own experience. You start to believe that your discomfort is evidence of your own dysfunction, rather than a reasonable response to an unreasonable situation. This is how intelligent, intuitive people end up feeling crazy. They're perceiving accurately, but they're being gaslit by a culture that insists on taking everything at face value. They're detecting the shadow energy that others are unconsciously broadcasting, but they're being told that shadows don't exist, that everything is exactly as it appears to be on the surface, and that their ability to sense psychological undercurrents is a character flaw rather than a sophisticated form of intelligence. The truth is that most people are completely unconscious of the energy they're putting out into the world. They genuinely believe they wish you well, even as their unconscious minds are broadcasting resentment, envy, or hostility on frequencies that sensitive people can't help but receive. They're not lying when they say they support you. They're just completely disconnected from the parts of themselves that feel threatened by your existence, your success, or your refusal to play the psychological games that make them feel safe. This disconnection creates a particularly insidious form of psychological toxicity because it's so difficult to address directly. How do you confront someone about energy they're not even aware they're transmitting? How do you have a conversation about hostility that's operating completely below the level of conscious awareness? How do you explain to someone that their unconscious mind is conducting psychological warfare against you while their conscious mind genuinely believes they care about your well-being? The answer isn't to become paranoid or to isolate yourself from all human contact. The answer is to develop what we might call energetic literacy, the ability to read the subtle communications that happen beneath the level of words, to trust your nervous system's assessment of safety and threat, and to make decisions based on the total picture rather than just the surface presentation. This means learning to honor your body's wisdom, even when it contradicts social expectations. It means trusting that feeling drained after spending time with certain people is valid information, not evidence of your own inadequacy. It means recognizing that some people's hidden shadows create environments that are simply not conducive to your psychological well-being, regardless of their conscious intentions or the social expectation that you should be able to get along with everyone. When you start to acknowledge this reality, you begin to understand why certain relationships feel so exhausting, why some social situations leave you feeling depleted for days, and why your attempts at self-care often feel futile if you're not. Also addressing the environmental factors that are working against your peace of mind. You realize that psychological health isn't just about managing your own internal state. It's also about curating an external environment that supports rather than undermines your well-being. The goal isn't to become hyper-vigilant or suspicious of everyone around you. The goal is to develop enough self-awareness to recognize when you're in an environment that's subtly hostile to your thriving, and enough self-respect to make choices that honor your psychological well-being rather than sacrificing it on the altar of social harmony, or the exhausting project of trying to prove that you're not as sensitive as you actually are. There's a particular kind of psychological torture that empathetic people inflict on themselves, and it goes something like this. You achieve something good, you feel happy about it for approximately 30 seconds, and then a wave of inexplicable guilt crashes over you like you've somehow committed a crime by allowing good things to happen in your life. You start apologizing to the universe for your success, minimizing your achievements, and feeling like your happiness is somehow taking light away from others who need it more. This isn't your guilt. It's someone else's envy that you're absorbing and misinterpreting as evidence of your own moral failings. But your brain, trained to scan for ways it might be responsible for others' emotional states, immediately begins constructing elaborate theories about why your happiness is somehow causing harm to the universe, why your success is evidence of your selfishness, and why feeling good about your life is a sign of your spiritual immaturity. The empathetic nervous system is like a highly sensitive radio that picks up emotional broadcasts from everyone in its vicinity. When someone around you feels threatened by your success, their unconscious mind starts transmitting resentment on a frequency that your system reads as danger. But instead of recognizing this resentment as information about their internal state, you interpret it as evidence that your happiness is inappropriate, excessive, or harmful to others. This is how you end up apologizing for good things happening to you. This is why you find yourself downplaying achievements, minimizing positive experiences, and feeling guilty for enjoying life when others seem to be struggling. You've learned to mistake other people's emotional immaturity for your own spiritual failing. You've been trained to believe that being happy while others are unhappy is evidence of your lack of compassion rather than evidence that you've managed to create something positive in your life. Carl Jung understood that projection is one of the most primitive psychological defense mechanisms. When people can't tolerate their own feelings of inadequacy, disappointment, or stagnation, they unconsciously project those feelings onto the people around them who seem to be thriving. The person who's stuck in their career resents your professional success and unconsciously broadcasts the message that your achievement is somehow problematic. The individual who's lonely resents your healthy relationship and subtly communicates that your happiness is evidence of your superficiality. The friend who's struggling financially feels triggered by your financial stability and projects the narrative that your prosperity is somehow undeserved or comes at others' expense. But here's the twist that most people miss. When someone projects their shadow onto you, they're not consciously aware they're doing it. They genuinely believe their resentment is justified, that there's something wrong with how you're living your life, that your happiness is somehow evidence of your selfishness or ignorance of others' struggles. They've convinced themselves that their inability to celebrate your success is actually evidence of their moral superiority, their deeper understanding of life's complexities, their more mature perspective on what really matters. This creates a psychological minefield for sensitive people. You start to feel the weight of others' unexpressed resentments, but you interpret that weight as your own responsibility. You begin to believe that being happy in a world where others are suffering is morally questionable. You start to think that your success comes at the expense of others, that your joy is somehow stealing light from people who need it more, that your achievements are evidence of your privilege rather than your effort. The spiritual bypassing community has made this problem worse by promoting the idea that all negative emotions are low vibrational, and that feeling guilty about your blessings is somehow more enlightened than enjoying them. This creates a psychological double bind, where you feel guilty about feeling good, and then guilty about feeling guilty, creating an endless spiral of self-blame that serves no one and actually prevents you from being able to contribute positively to others' lives because you're too busy managing your own self-imposed emotional prison. The truth is that dimming your light doesn't make anyone else brighter. Minimizing your success doesn't make others more successful. Feeling guilty about your happiness doesn't alleviate anyone else's suffering. In fact, it often does the opposite. It enables other people's unconscious resentments by confirming their narrative that your well-being is somehow problematic, and it prevents you from being able to share your gifts, your resources, and your positive energy with the world because you're too busy apologizing for having them. When you absorb someone else's envy and mistake it for your own guilt, you're participating in a psychological transaction that benefits no one. You're allowing their inability to process their own emotions to become your emotional burden. You're letting their unconscious hostility convince you that your thriving is evidence of your moral failure. You're enabling their psychological immaturity by taking responsibility for feelings that aren't yours to manage. This dynamic is particularly toxic because it's self-reinforcing. The more guilty you feel about your success, the more you'll unconsciously sabotage your own progress to make others comfortable. The more you minimize your achievements, the more you signal to others that their resentment is justified. The more you apologize for your happiness, the more you teach people that your joy is something that requires an apology, creating a psychological environment where your well-being becomes a source of tension rather than celebration. Breaking this pattern requires developing what we might call emotional sovereignty, the ability to distinguish between your own emotional states and the emotional states of others. It means learning to recognize when that wave of guilt following a positive experience isn't actually about anything you've done wrong, but about someone else's inability to celebrate your success without making it about their own inadequacy. This doesn't mean becoming callous or insensitive to others' struggles. It means recognizing that taking responsibility for other people's emotional reactions to your success is neither helpful nor spiritually evolved. It's actually a form of codependency disguised as compassion, a way of avoiding the uncomfortable reality that not everyone in your life is psychologically healthy enough to celebrate your happiness without making it about their own pain. Consider the metaphor of a candle that tries to dim itself so as not to make the darkness feel bad about being dark. The candle's job is to burn brightly, not to manage the darkness's feelings about the light. The darkness's discomfort with the light isn't the candle's responsibility. It's information about the darkness's relationship to illumination. When you start to understand this distinction, you begin to see how much energy you've been wasting trying to make your light acceptable to people who are uncomfortable with brightness itself. The practice here isn't to become arrogant or dismissive of others' feelings. The practice is to develop enough emotional clarity to recognize when you're absorbing projections that don't belong to you. To notice when that familiar guilt spiral starts and to ask yourself, is this actually about something I've done wrong, or am I picking up on someone else's discomfort with my success? Most of the time, you'll discover that the guilt is a signal that someone in your environment is struggling with their own shadow material around success, happiness, or fulfillment. Their unconscious mind is broadcasting resentment, and your empathetic system is receiving it and translating it into self-criticism. But that resentment isn't information about you. It's information about their internal relationship to their own unlived life, their own unrealized potential, their own fear of pursuing what would make them genuinely happy. Once you understand this dynamic, you can begin to develop energetic boundaries that allow you to maintain compassion for others without absorbing their unprocessed emotions as your own responsibility. You can feel sad that someone is struggling without feeling guilty that you're not struggling. You can have empathy for someone's challenges without making your success evidence of your insensitivity. You can wish someone well without sacrificing your own well-being to make them feel better about their choices. This shift in perspective is liberating because it allows you to enjoy your life without constantly scanning for evidence that your happiness is somehow problematic. It frees you from the exhausting task of trying to manage other people's emotional reactions to your well-being. It allows you to be fully present with your own experience rather than constantly moderating it based on others' comfort levels. The goal isn't to become selfish or to ignore the very real suffering that exists in the world. The goal is to recognize that your guilt about your own well-being doesn't actually help anyone who's suffering, and often prevents you from being able to contribute positively to others' lives because you're too busy managing your own self-imposed emotional prison. When you're free to enjoy your successes, you're also free to use your resources, energy, and positive influence to actually make a difference in the world rather than just feeling bad about the good things in your life. There's a particular kind of psychological cruelty that comes wrapped in concern, delivered with care, and administered with what appears to be love. It's the suffocating embrace that feels like being slowly strangled by someone who insists they're only trying to help you breathe. It's the kind of relationship where affection becomes a weapon and care becomes a form of control. But everything looks so loving from the outside that questioning it feels like ingratitude, like evidence of your own inability to appreciate the people who care about you most. This is perhaps the most confusing form of hidden hostility because it exploits your need for connection while simultaneously undermining your autonomy. The person engaging in this behavior often genuinely believes they love you, even as their unconscious mind works systematically to diminish your independence, confidence, and ability to trust your own judgment. They're not consciously plotting your downfall. They're simply unable to love you without also needing to control you, unable to care for you without also needing you to remain dependent on their care. These relationships operate on what we might call conditional caring, love that's contingent on your willingness to remain small, dependent, and controllable. The moment you start to grow in ways that threaten their sense of importance or control, the caring becomes criticism, the concern becomes manipulation, and the love reveals itself to be a sophisticated form of emotional imprisonment designed to keep you from becoming too independent, too confident, or too capable of making decisions without their input. Narcissistic psychology has given us language for some of these dynamics, but what we're talking about here goes deeper than conscious manipulation. We're talking about people whose own psychological wounds create an unconscious need to keep others wounded in order to feel secure. They're not plotting your downfall in some calculated way. They're simply unable to tolerate your independence because it triggers their own fears of abandonment, inadequacy, or irrelevance. The person who loves you but can't celebrate your successes because they remind them of their own failures. The family member who supports your dreams but somehow always finds reasons why now isn't the right time to pursue them, why you need more preparation, why the risks are too great. The friend who offers endless advice but becomes cold and distant when you don't follow it, treating your autonomy as a personal rejection. The partner who says they want you to be happy but subtly punishes you every time you experience joy that doesn't center around them or require their participation. These relationships create a psychological double bind, where questioning the love feels like ingratitude, but accepting the love feels like psychological suffocation. You find yourself walking on eggshells around people who claim to adore you, constantly managing their emotions to avoid triggering their disappointment, anger, or withdrawal of affection. You learn to edit your experiences before sharing them, to downplay your independence, to avoid threatening their sense of importance, to seek their permission for decisions that should be entirely your own. The mask of love makes this dynamic, particularly insidious because it exploits your highest values, your capacity for gratitude, loyalty, and compassion, to keep you trapped in patterns that are slowly eroding your sense of self. You tell yourself that you should be grateful for their concern, that their control comes from a place of caring, that their inability to support your independence is evidence of how much they need you, how important you are to their well-being. But love that requires you to remain small isn't love. It's possession disguised as affection. Care that demands you stay dependent isn't care. It's control dressed up as concern. Support that's contingent on your willingness to accept. Limitations isn't support. It's sabotage wrapped in helpfulness. These dynamics create what we might call loving prisons. Relationships that feel nurturing on the surface, but are actually designed to prevent your growth, your independence, and your ability to trust your own judgment. Jung understood that the shadow often operates through our virtues rather than our vices. The most dangerous psychological manipulations come not from people who openly hate us, but from people whose love is contaminated by their own unresolved wounds. They use our desire to be good, grateful, and loving against us, creating situations where asserting our autonomy feels like betraying their care, where growing beyond their comfort zone feels like abandoning their love. This is why many people find it easier to distance themselves from openly hostile individuals than from those whose hostility is hidden beneath layers of apparent affection. At least with overt enemies, you know where you stand. You can defend yourself without feeling guilty about it. You can maintain your boundaries without wondering if you're being ungrateful. With covert controllers, you're constantly questioning your own perceptions, wondering if you're being ungrateful, selfish, or unreasonable for wanting independence from someone who claims to love you so much. The key to recognizing this dynamic is to pay attention to how you feel after interactions with these individuals. Genuine love leaves you feeling more like yourself, not less. Authentic care increases your confidence rather than undermining it. Real support helps you trust your own judgment rather than constantly second-guessing yourself. True affection makes you feel free to grow, to change, to make mistakes, to pursue your own path without having to constantly manage someone else's feelings about your choices. If you consistently feel drained, confused, or smaller after spending time with someone who claims to love you, you're probably dealing with love that's been contaminated by their unconscious hostility toward your independence. If their affection seems to increase when you're struggling and decrease when you're thriving, you're probably experiencing care that's more about their need to feel needed than about your actual well-being. If their support comes with strings attached, conditions that limit your growth, or expectations that you'll continue to need them in ways that prevent your development, you're dealing with control disguised as love. The metaphor here is the embrace that becomes a stranglehold. It starts as genuine affection, but slowly tightens until you can barely breathe. And when you struggle to free yourself, you're told that your discomfort is evidence of your inability to accept love. You're made to feel that the problem isn't the stranglehold, but your resistance to it. You're convinced that wanting to breathe freely is evidence of your ingratitude for the embrace. Breaking free from these dynamics requires developing what we might call discernment between love and possession. True love wants you to become more fully yourself, not a smaller version of yourself that's easier to manage. Authentic care supports your independence rather than fostering dependence. Genuine concern helps you develop your own judgment rather than replacing it with someone else's. Real affection celebrates your growth rather than feeling threatened by it. This doesn't mean becoming suspicious of everyone who expresses care for you. It means learning to recognize the difference between love that liberates and love that imprisons, between concern that empowers and concern that disables, between support that helps you grow and support that keeps you dependent. It means trusting your body's wisdom when someone's love feels suffocating rather than nurturing, when their care feels controlling rather than freeing. The people engaging in these patterns are often unconscious of what they're doing. They genuinely experience their control is care, their possession is love, their sabotage is protection. Confronting them directly often leads to confusion and defensiveness because they truly believe their intentions are pure. They can't see how their own unresolved wounds are contaminating their capacity for healthy love. The solution isn't necessarily to cut off these relationships, though sometimes that becomes necessary for your psychological survival. The solution is to develop enough psychological independence to stop seeking their approval for your growth, to stop requiring their permission for your happiness, and to stop accepting their limitations as the boundaries of your life. It means learning to receive whatever genuine love they're capable of offering while protecting yourself from the control, manipulation, and emotional imprisonment that comes disguised as care. This means learning to set boundaries not just around what you won't tolerate, but around what you won't allow to influence your decisions about your own life. It means developing the courage to disappoint people whose love is contingent on your willingness to remain smaller than you naturally are. It means accepting that some people can only love you to the extent that you don't threaten their sense of control, importance, or psychological safety. The goal is to surround yourself with people whose love expands rather than contracts your sense of possibility, whose care increases rather than diminishes your self-trust, and whose support helps you become more fully yourself rather than a version of yourself that's easier for them to handle. This kind of love exists, but you'll never find it if you continue to accept substitutes that masquerade as the real thing. Your nervous system is running a sophisticated threat detection program that makes the most advanced security software look primitive. It's constantly scanning facial expressions for micro-movements that indicate deception, analyzing vocal tones for undertones of hostility, measuring the microseconds between question and response to detect calculation rather than spontaneous honesty, and calculating the energetic math of every interaction to determine one crucial thing: is this person safe or dangerous to your psychological well-being? The problem is that you've been trained to override this system in favor of social politeness, rational analysis, and the exhausting work of giving everyone the benefit of the doubt. You've learned to apologize for your intuition, to doubt your gut feelings, and to prioritize other people's comfort over your own survival instincts. This is how you end up in situations where your body is screaming danger while your mind is insisting that everything is fine, where your nervous system is preparing for psychological warfare while your rational brain is constructing explanations for why your discomfort is unreasonable. The disconnect between physical intuition and mental rationalization creates a particular kind of psychological suffering. You know something is wrong, but you can't prove it. You feel threatened, but you can't justify it. You want to distance yourself from certain people, but you can't articulate why without sounding paranoid, oversensitive, or judgmental. You end up feeling crazy for trusting your own perceptions, like you're failing some test of social sophistication by being unable to override your body's assessment of psychological safety. This is the pain of being a highly sensitive person, in a world that privileges rational explanation over embodied knowing. Your nervous system is giving you accurate information about the psychological safety of your environment, but you've been conditioned to dismiss this information as irrelevant, unreliable, or socially inappropriate. You've been taught that if you can't rationally explain why someone makes you uncomfortable, then your discomfort is invalid, a sign of your own psychological dysfunction rather than sophisticated intelligence about your environment. Carl Jung wrote extensively about the wisdom of the unconscious mind, but he could have just as easily written about the wisdom of the unconscious body. Your physical being is constantly processing information that your conscious mind either can't access or chooses to ignore. The tightness in your chest around certain people, the way your stomach knots when specific individuals text you, the inexplicable fatigue that follows particular social interactions, the way your breathing becomes shallow in certain environments, the tension that settles in your shoulders when you're in the presence of people whose energy feels hostile to your well-being. These aren't random physical symptoms. They're your body's way of communicating its assessment of your psychological environment. Your nervous system has detected something that your rational mind has missed or dismissed, and it's trying to get your attention through the language of physical sensation. It's providing you with real-time feedback about the energetic quality of your relationships, the psychological safety of your environment, and the likely impact of certain people on your well-being. The problem is that we live in a culture that treats the body as a servant of the mind rather than as a source of intelligence in its own right. We've been taught to use our bodies to carry out our mental decisions rather than to listen to our bodies for information that our minds might be missing. This creates a hierarchy where physical knowing is seen as less reliable than mental knowing, even though the body often has access to information that the mind is structurally incapable of processing. Consider what happens when you meet someone for the first time and immediately feel uneasy, but they haven't done anything you can point to as objectively problematic. Your rational mind begins constructing explanations for why your discomfort is unreasonable. Maybe you're being judgmental based on their appearance. Maybe you're projecting past experiences onto the present situation. Maybe you're just having an off day and interpreting neutral interactions as threatening. Maybe you're being classist, racist, or otherwise prejudiced in ways that your conscious mind doesn't want to acknowledge. Meanwhile, your nervous system has detected micro-expressions, analyzed vocal patterns, measured response times, calculated the energetic signature of this person's emotional state, and processed hundreds of subtle cues that your conscious mind couldn't replicate even if it wanted to. Your body is giving you sophisticated intelligence about this person's psychological state, their level of emotional safety, their likely impact on your well-being, and their unconscious intentions toward you, but you've been trained to dismiss this intelligence as irrelevant superstition. This dismissal of somatic intelligence has profound consequences for your psychological safety. When you consistently override your body's warnings in favor of social expectations, you train yourself to tolerate situations and relationships that are subtly toxic to your well-being. You end up in scenarios where you're being slowly poisoned by proximity to people whose energy is hostile to your thriving, but you can't access this information because you've learned to distrust the very system that's designed to protect you. The path back to trusting your embodied wisdom requires what we might call somatic rehabilitation, the process of relearning to listen to your body's intelligence without immediately dismissing it as irrational, oversensitive, or socially inappropriate. This doesn't mean becoming paranoid or suspicious of everyone around you. It means developing the capacity to hold both your rational assessments and your embodied knowing as valid sources of information about your environment. This process often begins with paying attention to the physical sensations that arise in different social contexts. Notice how your body feels around different people. Does your breathing become shallow or deep? Do your muscles tense or relax? Does your energy expand or contract? Does your posture open or close? Do you feel energized or drained? These physical responses are providing you with real-time feedback about the psychological safety of your environment, the energetic compatibility of different relationships, and the likely impact of various people on your well-being. The next step is learning to honor this information, even when you can't rationally justify it. If your body consistently feels unsafe around someone who seems perfectly nice, that's information worth taking seriously, even if you can't explain it in ways that would satisfy a rational analysis. Your nervous system has access to data that your conscious mind simply cannot process. The subtle asymmetries in facial expressions that indicate deception, the micro delays in response that suggest calculation rather than authenticity, the energetic signature of someone whose conscious intentions don't match their unconscious hostility. The practice here is learning to trust your body's assessment while also remaining open to updating that assessment based on new information. This isn't about becoming rigid or paranoid, but about developing what we might call intelligent caution, the ability to protect yourself based on embodied intelligence while remaining emotionally available to people who prove themselves to be psychologically safe over time. Many people struggle with this because they've been taught that trusting their intuition about people is somehow morally questionable, that it makes them judgmental or discriminatory. But there's a profound difference between prejudice based on irrelevant characteristics and discernment based on energetic information. Your body doesn't care what someone looks like, what they do for a living, or what their social status is. It cares about whether their energy feels safe or threatening to your well-being. The metaphor here is the serpent in the garden, something that looks beautiful on the surface, but carries venom that could poison your entire ecosystem. Your rational mind sees the beauty and decides that your fear of snakes is irrational, primitive, unfounded. Your body detects the venom and prepares to protect you. The question becomes, which intelligence are you going to trust? Learning to trust your somatic intelligence often means going through a period of recalibration where you start paying attention to patterns you've been trained to ignore. Notice which people consistently leave you feeling energized versus drained. Observe which relationships feel expansive versus contractive. Pay attention to which environments make your body feel relaxed versus vigilant. Start to map the territory of your own nervous system's responses to different people and situations. This practice often reveals uncomfortable truths about relationships you've been trying to force yourself to feel good about. You might discover that certain family members, despite their stated love for you, consistently leave you feeling diminished. You might realize that some friendships, while fun on the surface, actually drain your energy because of underlying competition or judgment. You might recognize that certain social environments, while appearing welcoming, actually trigger your nervous system's threat detection systems. The goal isn't to become isolated or suspicious of everyone around you. The goal is to develop enough somatic awareness to make conscious choices about how much time and energy you invest in different relationships based on their actual impact on your well-being, rather than on social expectations or guilt about disappointing others. This process of learning to trust your body's intelligence often brings up resistance from people whose access to you depends on your willingness to override your own perceptions. The family members who insist that you're too sensitive when you start setting boundaries based on how their behavior affects your nervous system. The friends who become defensive when you begin limiting your availability based on your body's feedback about which relationships actually nourish you. The colleagues who label you as difficult when you stop forcing yourself to be comfortable in environments that your body clearly identifies as psychologically unsafe. The resistance you encounter when you start honoring your somatic intelligence is often the clearest indication that you've been surrounded by people whose access to you depends on your willingness to ignore your own well-being. Healthy people don't become threatened when you start taking better care of yourself. They don't punish you for developing better boundaries or for trusting your own perceptions about what feels safe and supportive. The illusion of advice, when concern is control in disguise. There's a particular form of psychological manipulation that operates under the guise of wisdom, care, and experience. It's the suffocating embrace of unsolicited advice, the constant stream of suggestions that feel less like guidance and more like directives, the kind of help that leaves you feeling smaller, more confused, and increasingly dependent on others' opinions about your own life. This isn't about people who occasionally offer perspective when asked. This is about individuals whose sense of self-worth seems to depend on their ability to direct, correct, and improve others. They position themselves as mentors, guides, and wise advisors, but their advice carries an undertone of judgment, superiority, and control that feels more like colonization than collaboration. The suffering here is multifaceted. First, there's the immediate experience of feeling infantilized by people who seem unable to trust your capacity to navigate your own existence. Then there's the deeper confusion that comes from wondering whether their constant corrections mean that you really are as incompetent as their behavior suggests. Finally, there's the exhausting work of having to defend your autonomy against people who claim to have your best interests at heart. These relationships create what we might call advisory dependency, a dynamic where you gradually lose confidence in your own judgment because you're constantly being told that someone else knows better. You start to second-guess decisions that feel right to you because you've been trained to believe that your instincts are unreliable, that your perspective is limited, that your approach to life requires constant correction and improvement. The most insidious aspect of this dynamic is how it exploits your humility, your desire to learn, and your respect for experience. It takes your openness to growth and uses it as a vehicle for control. You want to be a good student, so you listen. You want to be respectful, so you consider their suggestions. You want to be humble, so you question your own judgment. Gradually, without realizing it, you become psychologically dependent on others. Approval for decisions that should be entirely your own. Jung would recognize this as a form of psychological possession, a dynamic where another person's psyche begins to operate your life through the vehicle of constant advice and correction. Your natural decision-making processes become contaminated by their opinions, their fears, their limitations, and their need to feel important through directing others' choices. The person who constantly offers suggestions about your career, your relationships, your lifestyle choices, your financial decisions, always with the stated intention of helping you avoid mistakes, but with the practical effect of keeping you tethered to their judgment rather than developing trust in your own. They frame their control as care, their intrusion as concern, their inability to respect your autonomy as evidence of how much they value your well-being. But here's what they're not telling you, what they might not even be aware of themselves. Their need to constantly advise others often comes from their own discomfort with uncertainty, their own fear of letting people make mistakes, their own unconscious belief that other people aren't capable of learning from experience without their guidance. In many cases, it's a projection of their own self-doubt. They can't trust their own judgment, so they certainly can't trust yours. The compulsive advisor often operates from a place of deep insecurity about their own relevance and importance. They've learned that being helpful is a way to maintain connection, to feel needed, to avoid the vulnerability of simply being loved for who they are rather than for what they provide. Their advice becomes a form of psychological insurance. As long as you need their guidance, they don't have to worry about being abandoned, ignored, or forgotten. This creates a particularly toxic dynamic because their psychological security depends on your continued dependence. They have an unconscious investment in your confusion, your self-doubt, and your inability to trust your own judgment. They need you to need them, which means they have a hidden agenda to keep you from developing the confidence and self-trust that would make their advice unnecessary. The advice giver's identity becomes so tied to being helpful that they literally cannot see you as capable without threatening their sense of self. They interpret your independence as rejection, your confidence as arrogance, your ability to make decisions without their input as evidence that you don't value their wisdom. This is why they often become cold, distant, or critical when you start trusting your own judgment. Your autonomy feels like abandonment to them. Recognizing this pattern requires developing what we might call advisory discernment, the ability to distinguish between guidance that empowers and guidance that disables, between advice that increases your confidence and advice that undermines it, between suggestions that respect your autonomy and suggestions that treat you like an extension of someone else's will. Genuine guidance feels expansive. It offers perspective, without insisting on a particular outcome. It respects your right to make decisions that the advisor wouldn't make. It increases your sense of possibility rather than limiting it to options that the advisor finds acceptable. Most importantly, it strengthens your relationship with your own judgment rather than replacing it with dependence on external authority. Controlling advice, on the other hand, feels contractive. It carries subtle or not so subtle criticism of your current approach. It implies that your way of doing things is somehow deficient or dangerous. It creates anxiety about making the wrong choice rather than confidence in your ability to learn from whatever choices you make. It positions the advisor as the authority on your life, and you as the student who needs constant correction. The metaphor here is the difference between a compass and a leash. A compass gives you information that helps you navigate, but respects your right to choose your own destination and your own path. A leash controls your movement by keeping you tethered to someone else's sense of where you should go and how you should get there. Breaking free from advisory control requires developing the courage to disappoint people whose sense of importance depends on your willingness to accept their guidance. It means learning to say thank you for your perspective without feeling obligated to follow suggestions that don't resonate with your own inner knowing. It means trusting that your mistakes are more valuable than someone else's version of your success. This doesn't mean becoming closed to input or feedback. It means becoming selective about whose opinions you invite into your decision-making process and maintaining the ultimate authority over your own choices. It means recognizing that people who truly care about your well-being want you to develop confidence in your own judgment, not dependence on theirs. The practice here is learning to distinguish between your own inner voice and the internalized voices of all the people who've been advising you throughout your life. Many people discover that what they thought was their own anxiety about decisions is actually the accumulated worry of advisors who've taught them to distrust their own instincts. When you start to separate your authentic concerns from inherited fears, you often find that your natural decision-making capacity is much more reliable than you've been led to believe. Phantom frequency, the danger of energetically empty environments. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who are physically present, but energetically absent, emotionally available in words, but not in spirit. It's the hollow feeling of connection without communion, interaction without intimacy, the psychological equivalent of trying to get nutrition from plastic food that looks real but provides no sustenance. These environments are populated by people who've learned to go through the motions of relationship without actually being present for it. They say the right words, perform the appropriate gestures, and maintain the social contracts, but something essential is missing: the spark of genuine engagement, the warmth of authentic interest, the electricity of real connection. Being around them feels like being in a room full of well-programmed robots who've mastered the appearance of humanity without actually possessing it. This isn't about people who are temporarily distracted or going through difficult periods. This is about individuals who've become so disconnected from their own emotional lives that they can no longer offer genuine presence to others. They're energetically vacant, operating on automatic pilot, engaging with life through a series of learned responses rather than authentic engagement. The danger of these environments is that they create what we might call relational starvation, a state where you're surrounded by social interaction but receiving no real nourishment from it. You end up feeling more alone in these relationships than you would in actual solitude, because at least solitude doesn't pretend to offer connection while failing to deliver it. What makes this particularly confusing is that these people often seem perfectly pleasant. They're not obviously hostile or problematic. They show up, they participate, they fulfill their social obligations. But spending time with them feels like eating air. You go through all the motions of consumption, but remain fundamentally unfed. Your soul starts to feel malnourished, despite being surrounded by what appears to be social abundance. The psychological impact of prolonged exposure to energetically empty environments is profound. You begin to question your own need for deeper connection, wondering if you're being too demanding, too needy, too complicated in your desire for relationships that actually nourish your spirit. You start to doubt whether genuine intimacy exists at all, or whether you've been naive to expect more from human connection than surface-level pleasantries and shared activities. This doubt is particularly damaging because it can lead you to settle for relationships that look functional from the outside, but leave you feeling spiritually starved on the inside. You convince yourself that your longing for deeper connection is unrealistic, that you should be grateful for what you have, that expecting people to be emotionally present is asking too much in our busy, distracted world. But the truth is that energetic presence is not a luxury, it's a basic requirement for psychological health. Human beings are wired for authentic connection, for the experience of being truly seen and met by others. When we're consistently exposed to pseudo-connection, interactions that look like intimacy but lack its essential quality, our nervous systems begin to shut down in self-protection. The neuroscience of connection reveals that genuine interpersonal engagement requires what researchers call neural synchrony, a state where two nervous systems attune to each other, creating a shared emotional field that allows for real communication and mutual influence. When this synchrony is absent, when people are interacting from a place of emotional disconnection or automatic responding, the interaction feels hollow because it literally lacks the neural foundation for authentic connection. People who operate in phantom frequency mode are often unconsciously dissociated from their own emotional experience. They've learned to function through mental processes while being disconnected from their hearts, their bodies, and their authentic emotional responses. This disconnection protects them from their own pain, but it also prevents them from offering genuine presence to others. Being around these individuals for extended periods can be deeply destabilizing for people who are emotionally sensitive or naturally empathetic. You find yourself trying to create connection with people who aren't actually available for it, like trying to have a conversation with someone who's sleepwalking. You might increase your efforts, become more animated, or try harder to engage them, but their fundamental unavailability remains unchanged. The metaphor here is the broken radio that looks functional but can't receive or transmit signals. You might spend hours trying to tune it, adjusting the antenna, changing the settings, but the problem isn't with your technique. The radio itself is fundamentally unable to perform its function. Similarly, people in phantom frequency mode might look relationally functional, but they lack the internal capacity for the kind of energetic exchange that creates genuine connection. Recognizing energetically empty environments requires developing sensitivity to the quality of presence that others bring to interactions. This isn't about judging people for their emotional unavailability, but about protecting your own psychological health by recognizing when you're in relationships that aren't actually nourishing your need for authentic connection. Signs of phantom frequency relationships include conversations that remain consistently surface level, despite your attempts to go deeper, interactions that feel performative rather than spontaneous, responses that seem rehearsed rather than genuine, and a persistent sense that you're engaging with someone's persona rather than their actual self. You might notice that these people rarely share anything vulnerable, ask meaningful questions about your inner life, or demonstrate genuine curiosity about who you are beneath your social role. The practice here isn't about trying to fix these relationships or awakening people to deeper presence. That's neither your responsibility nor within your power. The practice is about recognizing when you're in an energetically barren environment and taking steps to ensure that you're also cultivating relationships that actually feed your soul. This might mean seeking out communities where authentic expression is valued, finding friends who are capable of emotional depth, or creating space in your life for solitude when that feels more nourishing than empty social interaction. It means learning to distinguish between social connection and spiritual communion, recognizing that not all relationships are capable of providing the kind of nourishment that your soul requires. The goal isn't to become judgmental of people who operate in phantom frequency mode. They're often doing the best they can with their current level of emotional development. The goal is to ensure that your own need for authentic connection is being met somewhere in your life, even if it's not being met in every relationship. The echo of envy. When your victory activates others' shadow. There's a moment that every successful person eventually encounters, the moment when you realize that your achievements have become a source of pain for people you care about. Not because your success has harmed them in any tangible way, but because your thriving has activated something in their psyche that they're not equipped to handle, the shadow of their own unlived potential. This is one of the loneliest aspects of personal growth. You work hard, you achieve something meaningful, you feel proud of your progress, and then you're confronted with the uncomfortable reality that your victory has somehow become someone else's wound. The light you've managed to kindle in your own life has illuminated the darkness in theirs, and they blame you for their discomfort with what that illumination reveals. The psychology of envy is more complex than simple jealousy. Jealousy wants what someone else has. Envy resents the fact that someone else has it. Jealousy says, "I want that too." Envy says, "You shouldn't have that." This distinction is crucial because it explains why some people respond to others' success with inspiration, while others respond with resentment. When your achievement triggers someone's envy, you're not just dealing with their desire for what you have, you're dealing with their unconscious belief that your having it somehow diminishes their own possibilities. They experience your success as evidence of their failure, your happiness as a spotlight on their misery, your growth as a reminder of their stagnation. This creates an impossible situation for anyone who's naturally generous and wants to share their joy with others. You find yourself having to choose between celebrating your achievements and maintaining certain relationships. You learn to downplay your successes, to minimize your happiness, to apologize for the good things in your life because sharing them authentically creates tension, resentment, or withdrawal from people you care about. The cruelest aspect of this dynamic is how it punishes you for becoming who you're meant to be. Your natural expansion triggers others' contraction. Your increasing confidence activates their insecurity. Your willingness to pursue your dreams reminds them of their own abandoned aspirations. Your success becomes a mirror that reflects their own self-betrayal back to them, and they experience your face in that mirror as the source of their discomfort. Jung understood that projection is often most intense when what we're projecting is something we desperately want but believe we can't have. The person who secretly longs for creative expression but has convinced themselves it's impractical becomes resentful of artists who've managed to make their creativity sustainable. The individual who dreams of travel but believes they're too responsible to pursue it feels triggered by friends who've prioritized adventure over security. The person who wants love but fears vulnerability resents those who found healthy relationships. Your success doesn't actually harm these people, but it does threaten their psychological defenses. They've built their identity around why they can't have what they want, why it's impossible, impractical, or irresponsible. Your achievement threatens this narrative by proving that what they believed was impossible is actually achievable, that what they thought was impractical might actually be practical, that what they convinced themselves was irresponsible might actually be the most responsible choice for someone who wants to live authentically. This is why envy often masquerades as moral superiority. Rather than acknowledging their resentment as information about their own unmet desires, envious people often construct elaborate justifications for why your success is somehow problematic. They convince themselves that you're selfish for pursuing your dreams while others struggle. They decide that your happiness is evidence of your superficiality or your ignorance of life's real challenges. They frame your achievements as luck, privilege, or moral failing rather than as the result of effort, courage, and commitment. The person who criticizes your career change as unrealistic while they remain stuck in a job they hate. The family. Member who suggests that your financial success has made you materialistic, while they struggle with money management. The friend who implies that your healthy relationship means you've settled or become boring, while they continue to choose partners who are emotionally unavailable. These responses aren't really about you. They're about the envious person's relationship to their own unrealized potential. Your success has activated their shadow, the part of their psyche that contains all the possibilities they've rejected, abandoned, or convinced themselves they're not worthy of pursuing. Instead of recognizing this activation as an invitation to examine their own choices, they make your success the problem. This dynamic is particularly painful when it involves family members or close friends whose approval and support you value. You want to share your excitement about positive developments in your life, but you learn that doing so creates distance, tension, or subtle punishment. You start to feel guilty for thriving, as if your happiness is somehow selfish or inconsiderate. The practice here is learning to maintain your joy and celebration even when others can't join you in it. This doesn't mean becoming callous or insensitive to others' struggles. It means recognizing that diminishing your light doesn't actually help anyone who's struggling with darkness. It just enables their continued avoidance of their own shadow work. You can feel compassion for people whose envy prevents them from celebrating your success without sacrificing your own right to feel proud of your achievements. You can understand that their resentment is about their own pain without taking responsibility for managing their emotional response to your growth. You can maintain love for people who can't support your expansion without allowing their limitations to become limitations on your own development. The metaphor here is the sun that doesn't dim itself, because some people prefer the darkness. The sun's job is to shine, not to manage the comfort level of those who find light challenging. Your job is to continue growing, achieving, and becoming who you're meant to be, regardless of whether everyone in your life is psychologically equipped to celebrate your journey. This often requires developing what we might call selective sharing. The wisdom to know which people in your life are genuinely capable of celebrating your success and which are likely to respond with resentment or withdrawal. It means creating a support system of people who are psychologically mature enough to feel genuinely happy for your achievements, rather than threatened by them. The goal isn't to become arrogant or to lose empathy for others' struggles. The goal is to maintain your commitment to your own growth and happiness, even when that growth activates uncomfortable feelings in others. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone who's triggered by your success is to continue succeeding, providing them with a living example that their dreams are achievable if they're willing to do the work to pursue them. The distance that grows in silence. When spiritual evolution creates isolation, there's a particular kind of grief that comes with spiritual and psychological growth, the gradual realization that your evolution is creating distance between you and people you love. Not because you want to be separate from them, but because you're literally beginning to vibrate on a different frequency, to see reality through different eyes, to value things that they don't understand or find threatening. This isn't the dramatic severance that comes from conflict or betrayal. This is the slow, almost imperceptible drift that happens when you start to change in fundamental ways, while others remain committed to staying exactly where they are. You find yourself speaking a language that feels foreign to people who used to understand you perfectly. Your concerns become incomprehensible to people who used to share your worldview. Your growth becomes a source of alienation rather than connection. The loneliness of spiritual evolution is perhaps one of the most misunderstood aspects of personal development. Popular culture presents growth as universally positive, as something that brings people together and strengthens relationships. But the reality is that profound change often requires leaving familiar territories, including the familiar territory of relationships that were built around who you used to be rather than who you're becoming. When you begin to prioritize inner peace over external drama, when you start setting boundaries instead of people-pleasing, when you choose authenticity over acceptance, when you begin to value depth over surface-level connection, you inevitably create friction with people whose sense of normalcy depends on maintaining the old patterns. Your evolution challenges their comfort zone, threatens their sense of predictability, and forces them to confront aspects of themselves they might prefer to keep hidden. This is why spiritual growth can feel so isolating. The very qualities that make you more psychologically healthy, increased self-awareness, stronger boundaries, reduced tolerance for dysfunction, commitment to authenticity, can make you less compatible with relationships that were built on unconscious patterns, codependent dynamics, or shared avoidance of deeper truths. The person who's worked on their communication skills finds themselves frustrated by family members who still rely on passive aggression and emotional manipulation. The individual who's developed emotional intelligence becomes exhausted by friends who continue to process their feelings through drama and reactivity. The person who's committed to personal responsibility feels alienated by people who remain invested in victim consciousness and blame. This evolution often creates what we might call vibrational incompatibility, a state where you and certain people in your life are operating on such different emotional and spiritual frequencies that genuine connection becomes increasingly difficult. It's not that either of you is wrong or bad. You've simply grown in directions that no longer allow for the kind of resonance that healthy relationships require. The guilt around this kind of natural drifting can be intense, particularly for people who've been conditioned to believe that love means accepting others exactly as they are, and that spiritual growth should make you more tolerant of dysfunction rather than less. You might find yourself trying to force compatibility with people whose energy no longer feels nourishing, convincing yourself that your discomfort is evidence of your own spiritual immaturity rather than a natural response to vibrational mismatch. But here's what spiritual bypassing culture doesn't tell you. Love doesn't require you to sacrifice your own well-being for the comfort of others. Compassion doesn't mean enabling other people's unconscious patterns. Growth doesn't obligate you to remain in relationships that drain your energy or require you to constantly contract yourself to maintain compatibility. The practice of conscious differentiation, the ability to love people while also acknowledging that you may no longer be compatible for close relationship, is one of the most challenging aspects of spiritual maturity. It requires developing the capacity to hold love and boundaries simultaneously, to maintain care for others, while also honoring your own need for relationships that support rather than undermine your continued growth. This process often involves what we might call grief for the living, mourning the loss of connection with people who are still physically present but no longer emotionally or spiritually accessible in the ways they once were. You grieve, not just for the relationships themselves, but for the version of yourself that was able to find satisfaction in those connections, for the innocence that allowed you to ignore red flags, for the unconsciousness that made certain dysfunctional patterns feel normal. The isolation that comes with growth is often temporary, but it can feel eternal when you're in the middle of it. You're no longer comfortable in your old relationships, but you haven't yet found your new tribe. You're between worlds, no longer, fitting in the spaces you used to occupy, but not yet having discovered where you belong. This liminal space is necessary for transformation, but it can feel like psychological purgatory. The metaphor here is the butterfly in the chrysalis, a creature that must completely dissolve its old form before it can emerge in its new one. During the dissolution phase, the caterpillar is neither what it was nor what it will become. It exists in a state of pure potential, but that potential comes at the cost of everything that once felt solid and familiar. Learning to navigate this transition requires developing what we might call evolutionary patience, the ability to trust that your current isolation is a necessary phase rather than a permanent state. It means having faith that as you continue to grow and evolve, you'll naturally attract people who can appreciate and support who you're becoming, rather than those who need you to remain who you were. This doesn't mean becoming cold or abandoning everyone from your past. It means recognizing that some relationships may need to shift in form, perhaps becoming less intimate or less frequent, while remaining loving in spirit. It means developing the discernment to know which relationships are worth the effort of trying to bridge different levels of consciousness, and which ones require the loving kindness of distance. The goal isn't to become spiritually elitist or to use personal growth as a justification for abandoning people who love you. The goal is to honor both your need for continued evolution and your capacity for love, by creating relationship dynamics that support your highest development while also respecting others' right to remain exactly where they are. This often requires releasing the fantasy that everyone you love will want to grow with you, that your evolution will inspire others to embark on their own journey of transformation, that love alone is enough to bridge fundamental incompatibilities in consciousness. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is create enough space for people to miss you, to wonder what you've discovered that brings you such peace, to perhaps become curious enough about your transformation to begin their own. The loneliness of growth is the price of authenticity, the cost of becoming who you really are, rather than who others need you to be. It's a temporary discomfort that leads to permanent liberation, the freedom to exist as yourself rather than as a character in other people's unconscious dramas. And while the space between your old life and your new one can feel empty and uncertain, it's actually pregnant with possibility, rich with potential for connections that will celebrate rather than tolerate your continued evolution. The noise. Beneath the surface, how collective anxiety infiltrates your energy field. There's an invisible frequency that permeates most social environments, a low-level buzz of collective anxiety, unspoken tension, and shared survival stress that operates beneath the surface of polite conversation. It's the psychological equivalent of electromagnetic radiation, constantly present but rarely acknowledged, slowly accumulating in your nervous system until you find yourself inexplicably agitated, restless, or depleted after what should have been normal social interactions. This collective anxiety field is created when groups of people gather while carrying unprocessed stress, unspoken resentments, financial fears, relationship tensions, and existential uncertainties that they've learned to mask but haven't learned to resolve. The result is an environment that looks functional on the surface, but feels psychologically toxic to anyone sensitive enough to detect the emotional undercurrents that most people have trained themselves to ignore. Think about the last time you were in a social gathering where everyone seemed to be having a good time, but you left feeling strangely exhausted or agitated. Your rational mind probably told you that you had enjoyed yourself, that the people were nice, that nothing obviously problematic had occurred. But your nervous system was processing information that your conscious mind wasn't equipped to handle. The micro-tensions in people's bodies, the forced quality of their laughter, the way conversations stayed relentlessly surface level as if diving deeper might trigger something dangerous. Modern social environments are often psychological minefields where people's unprocessed trauma, unexpressed emotions, and unacknowledged fears create an atmosphere of chronic low-level threat. Everyone has learned to function while carrying enormous amounts of internal stress, but very few people have learned to actually process and release that stress. The result is that most social gatherings become inadvertent sharing sessions where people's unhealed wounds contaminate the energetic atmosphere. The highly sensitive person walks into this environment and immediately begins absorbing the collective emotional field. Their nervous system starts trying to process not just their own experience, but the unprocessed anxiety of everyone around them. They become like a psychic sponge, soaking up the fear, tension, and unresolved trauma that others are unconsciously broadcasting, often without realizing that what they're feeling isn't actually their own. This dynamic is particularly prevalent in family systems, where multiple generations of unprocessed trauma create what we might call hereditary anxiety fields. The family gathering where everyone is trying to maintain the appearance of normalcy, while ancient resentments, unspoken disappointments, and inherited fears poison the atmosphere. The holiday dinners where the conversation stays light and cheerful while underneath decades of family dysfunction create an undertone of psychological danger that sensitive family members absorb as their own anxiety. Corporate environments often operate as sophisticated anxiety amplification systems, where people's financial fears, career insecurities, and workplace trauma combine to create atmospheres of chronic stress disguised as productivity. The office where everyone seems professional and competent while underneath, job insecurity, interpersonal competition, and systemic dysfunction create a field of collective fight-or-flight activation that sensitive employees absorb until they can no longer distinguish between their own work stress and the accumulated anxiety of their entire workplace. Social media has created unprecedented opportunities for anxiety contagion, where millions of people's fears, outrage, and existential terror get broadcast instantly across global networks. The highly sensitive person opens their phone to check messages and immediately gets hit with the collective anxiety of everyone in their network, the shared trauma of global events, and the accumulated stress of a species that's struggling to adapt to technological and social changes that are happening faster than human psychology can process. The practice of recognizing anxiety contagion requires developing what we might call emotional source tracking, the ability to distinguish between anxiety that originates from your own circumstances and anxiety that you're absorbing from your environment. This isn't about becoming paranoid or avoiding all social contact. It's about developing enough emotional sophistication to recognize when you're being affected by energies that don't belong to you. This process often begins with paying attention to how your emotional state changes in different environments. Notice whether your anxiety increases in certain social situations, whether your mood shifts when you're around particular groups of people, whether you feel more agitated after consuming certain types of media or spending time in specific locations. These shifts in your internal state are providing you with information about the psychological quality of different environments. The next step is learning to create energetic boundaries that allow you to maintain your own emotional equilibrium while moving through environments that might be psychologically contaminated. This doesn't mean becoming cold or disconnected from others. It means developing the capacity to remain present and compassionate without absorbing other people's unprocessed emotions as your own responsibility. One of the most effective practices for managing anxiety contagion is what we might call conscious arrival. The practice of taking a moment before entering social environments to ground yourself in your own energy, to set an intention to remain connected to your own emotional center, and to create a mental boundary between your internal state and whatever emotional field you're about to encounter. This might involve taking a few deep breaths in your car before entering a family gathering, spending a moment in meditation before opening social media, or simply pausing to notice your current emotional state before engaging with environments that you know tend to be psychologically challenging. The goal is to maintain enough self-awareness to recognize when your emotional state is being influenced by external factors rather than internal ones. Another crucial practice is what we might call energy hygiene, the process of consciously clearing absorbed emotions and anxiety after exposure to psychologically contaminated environments. This might involve physical practices like exercise, time in nature, or somatic techniques that help discharge accumulated stress. It might include emotional practices like journaling, talking with trusted friends, or engaging in creative expression that helps process and release emotions that don't belong to you. The metaphor here is the difference between being a sponge and being a duck. A sponge absorbs everything it encounters and becomes heavy with accumulated moisture. A duck's feathers are designed to repel water, allowing the duck to move through wet environments without becoming waterlogged. Learning to navigate psychologically toxic environments requires developing duck-like qualities, the ability to move through contaminated spaces without absorbing their toxicity. This doesn't mean becoming emotionally unavailable or losing your capacity for empathy. It means developing enough emotional sophistication to distinguish between genuine empathy, feeling with someone in a way that supports both of you, and emotional absorption, taking on someone else's unprocessed feelings in a way that depletes you without actually helping them. The goal is to maintain your capacity for genuine connection while protecting yourself from the psychological pollution that characterizes many modern social environments. This allows you to be present with others' authentic emotions while avoiding the exhaustion that comes from absorbing their unprocessed anxiety, trauma, and stress. The prison of agreeableness. When being accepted means being less. There's a particular form of psychological imprisonment that comes disguised as social success, the prison of agreeableness, where your acceptance by others depends on your willingness to make yourself smaller, less intense, less authentic, and ultimately less yourself. It's the exhausting performance of being perpetually pleasant, accommodating and unthreatening, even when doing so requires you to abandon your own truth, suppress your genuine reactions, and betray your deepest knowing about what you need to thrive. This prison is built not with bars and walls, but with subtle social pressures, unspoken expectations, and the constant threat of rejection if you fail to maintain the carefully constructed persona that others find comfortable. You learn to monitor your energy, to modulate your enthusiasm, to edit your opinions, and to constantly adjust your authentic self to match what you perceive others need from you in order to maintain their approval. The tragedy of this dynamic is that it takes your greatest strengths, your capacity for empathy, your desire for harmony, your willingness to consider others' needs, and uses them against you. Your natural sensitivity to others' comfort becomes a tool for self-betrayal. Your desire to be loving becomes a reason to accept less love than you deserve. Your capacity for understanding becomes an excuse for others to avoid understanding you. You start to believe that love is conditional on your ability to be easy, pleasant, and undemanding. You learn that acceptance requires you to be smaller than you naturally are, less passionate about things that matter to you, less direct about your needs, less authentic about your feelings. You begin to equate being loved with being controllable, being valued with being convenient, being wanted with being willing to disappear parts of yourself that others find challenging. This pattern often begins in childhood with families, schools, or social environments that reward compliance and punish authenticity. The child who learns that their natural exuberance is too much, that their emotional intensity is dramatic, that their questions are inappropriate, that their needs are demanding. They begin to understand that love and acceptance are contingent on their ability to be the version of themselves that others find easiest to handle. As adults, these individuals often become masters of reading social cues, adjusting their energy to match what they perceive others need, and performing versions of themselves that are designed to minimize conflict and maximize acceptance. They develop sophisticated radar for detecting other people's discomfort and equally sophisticated strategies for managing that discomfort by changing themselves rather than risking the possibility that someone might not like who they really are. The psychological cost of this constant self-editing is enormous. You begin to lose track of who you actually are beneath all the adjustments and accommodations. Your authentic reactions become buried under layers of socially acceptable responses. Your genuine needs get buried under your habitual focus on meeting others' needs. Your real opinions get filtered through constant calculations about what others want to hear. Eventually, you may find yourself in the bizarre position of being surrounded by people who claim to love you while feeling completely unknown and unseen. You're accepted, but only for the carefully curated version of yourself that you've learned to present. You're valued, but only for your willingness to be whatever others need you to be. You're included, but only as long as you don't disrupt the group dynamic by being too much yourself. The agreeableness prison is particularly insidious because it's reinforced by a culture that tells us that difficult people are selfish, that having strong opinions is divisive, that emotional intensity is immature, that setting boundaries is mean. You're taught to see your own authenticity as a character flaw rather than as the foundation of genuine relationship. But here's what the culture of enforced agreeableness doesn't tell you. People who require you to be smaller than you naturally are in order to feel comfortable around you are not actually capable of loving you. They're only capable of loving their projection of who they need you to be. They're in relationship with their fantasy of you rather than with your actual self, real love, the kind that actually nourishes your soul rather than just stroking. Your ego celebrates your full range of expression. It welcomes your intensity, your complexity, your contradictions, and your growth. It doesn't require you to be perpetually pleasant, endlessly accommodating, or constantly careful about your impact on others' comfort levels. The practice of breaking free from the agreeableness prison requires what we might call authenticity, courage, the willingness to risk disapproval, rejection, or conflict in order to remain true to yourself. This doesn't mean becoming deliberately difficult or intentionally provocative. It means stopping the constant self-monitoring and editing that prevents others from encountering your real self. This process often begins with small experiments, Inauthenticity, expressing a genuine opinion when you would normally stay silent, saying no to a request when you would normally automatically say yes, sharing a feeling when you would normally keep it to yourself. These experiments help you discover that authentic expression, while sometimes uncomfortable for others, actually creates the possibility for genuine connection in ways that performed agreeableness never can. The fear that keeps most people trapped in the agreeableness prison is the terror of abandonment, the belief that if people saw who you really are, they would reject you. But this fear is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of human psychology. People are generally drawn to authenticity even when it challenges them. They respect honesty even when it's inconvenient. They're attracted to genuine passion even when it's intense. What people actually find threatening is not your authenticity, but your inauthenticity. The sense that you're performing rather than being, that you're managing their experience of you rather than simply being yourself. The person who's constantly adjusting themselves to be what others want creates an uncanny valley effect. They seem almost right, but something essential is missing, creating an unconscious sense of unease in others. The paradox of agreeableness is that the very strategy you use to ensure acceptance actually prevents genuine acceptance. People can't truly accept you if they never encounter your real self. They can only accept the performance you're giving, which means you remain fundamentally unknown and therefore unloved in the deepest sense. Breaking free from this prison requires developing what we might call selective authenticity, the wisdom to know when and with whom to share your full self. Not everyone deserves access to your complete authenticity, but everyone in your inner circle should be capable of handling your real self without requiring you to constantly manage their comfort with who you are. This often means going through a period of relationship revision where you discover which people in your life can love your authentic self and which people can only tolerate your performed self. Some relationships may deepen through this process, while others may naturally drift away as it becomes clear that they were based on your willingness to be someone you're not. The goal isn't to become deliberately difficult or to use authenticity as an excuse for being inconsiderate. The goal is to create a life where you can be yourself without constantly calculating the impact of your genuine expression on others. Comfort levels. It's to surround yourself with people who celebrate rather than merely tolerate your full range of human expression. The metaphor here is the difference between a garden where all the plants are trimmed into identical shapes and a wild meadow where different species grow according to their nature. The manicured garden might look more orderly and comfortable, but the wild meadow is more alive, more diverse, and ultimately more beautiful, because each plant is free to express its essential nature. When you stop trying to be the version of yourself that everyone finds comfortable and start being the version of yourself that feels authentic, you create space for relationships based on genuine compatibility rather than mutual performance. You attract people who appreciate your real qualities rather than people who need you to hide your challenging aspects. You build a life that celebrates rather than merely accommodates who you actually are. Conclusion: the art of energetic sovereignty. As we reach the end of this exploration into the hidden dynamics that shape our psychological environment, it's important to recognize that awareness alone isn't enough. Understanding how projection, energy vampirism, and unconscious hostility operate in your relationships is only the beginning. The real work lies in developing what we might call energetic sovereignty, the capacity to maintain your psychological well-being regardless of the conscious or unconscious agendas of others. This sovereignty isn't about becoming cold, disconnected, or suspicious of everyone around you. It's about developing enough self-awareness to recognize when your energy is being drained, your boundaries are being violated, or your authentic self is being suppressed by social dynamics that masquerade as normal relationship patterns. It's about learning to trust your nervous system's assessment of psychological safety, even when that assessment contradicts social expectations or rational analysis. The highly sensitive person, the empath, the psychological canary in the coal mine, these individuals serve a crucial function in our social evolution. They detect the toxicity that others have learned to ignore or tolerate. They feel the emotional pollution that contaminates so many modern environments. They recognize the difference between genuine love and its sophisticated counterfeits. Their sensitivity isn't a character flaw to be overcome, it's intelligence to be honored and protected. But this intelligence requires careful cultivation. Without proper boundaries, the sensitive person becomes overwhelmed by others' unprocessed emotions. Without discernment, the empath absorbs toxicity thinking they're being helpful. Without sovereignty, the highly intuitive individual becomes enslaved to others' psychological dysfunction, while being told that their discomfort is evidence of their own inadequacy. The practice of energetic sovereignty requires developing multiple capacities simultaneously. You need the emotional intelligence to distinguish between your feelings and others' feelings. You need the somatic awareness to recognize when your body is detecting threats that your mind wants to rationalize away. You need the spiritual maturity to love people while also acknowledging that not everyone is psychologically healthy enough to have intimate access to your energy. Most importantly, you need the courage to disappoint people whose acceptance is contingent on your willingness to remain smaller than you naturally are. This courage isn't about being selfish or inconsiderate. It's about recognizing that relationships built on your self-betrayal aren't actually loving, no matter how they might appear from the outside. The world needs people who are willing to model what healthy boundaries look like, what authentic self-expression sounds like, what genuine emotional maturity feels like. It needs individuals who refuse to participate in the collective agreement, to pretend that dysfunction is normal, that toxicity is tolerable, that love requires self-abandonment. Your sensitivity is not a burden to be managed. It's a gift to be protected and shared wisely. Your intuition is not paranoia to be overcome. It's intelligence to be trusted and honored. Your need for authentic connection is not neediness to be ashamed of. It's a healthy requirement for psychological well-being. The goal isn't to become invulnerable to others' energy, but to become selective about which energies you allow to influence your internal state. It's to develop the capacity to remain open-hearted, while also being discerning about who gets access to your most intimate emotional spaces. It's to create a life that honors both your need for connection and your need for psychological safety. This work is ongoing, requiring constant refinement of your ability to read psychological environments, trust your embodied wisdom, and make choices that honor your authentic needs rather than others' expectations. It's the work of becoming fully yourself in a world that profits from your self-betrayal, of maintaining your sensitivity in environments that punish emotional intelligence, of continuing to love while refusing to accept substitutes for genuine care. Remember that every time you honor your boundaries, you give others permission to honor theirs. Every time you trust your intuition, you model what emotional intelligence looks like. Every time you choose authenticity over agreeableness, you create space for others to do the same. Your commitment to your own psychological sovereignty isn't selfish, it's revolutionary. In a world filled with people who've learned to tolerate toxicity, your insistence on psychological health becomes a beacon. In environments contaminated by unprocessed trauma, your emotional clarity becomes medicine. In relationships built on mutual performance, your authenticity becomes an invitation to genuine intimacy. The hidden hatred that surrounds us, the projection, envy, control, and unconscious hostility, only has power over us when we remain unconscious of its presence. Once we develop the ability to recognize these dynamics, to trust our perceptions of them, and to make choices that protect our psychological well-being, we become free to love more deeply, connect more authentically, and live more fully than we ever could while trying to accommodate everyone's comfort with our existence. Your life is not a democracy where everyone gets to vote on how you should be. Your energy is not a public utility that everyone deserves access to regardless of how they treat it. Your peace of mind is not a sacrifice you owe to people whose psychological dysfunction creates chaos in your environment. The most radical thing you can do in a world that profits from your disconnection from yourself is to remain connected to your own truth, your own needs, your own sense of what feels healthy and life-giving. This connection becomes your North Star, guiding you toward relationships and environments that celebrate rather than merely tolerate your authentic expression. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, remember that you are not responsible for managing other people's psychological comfort with your existence. You are not obligated to make yourself smaller, so that others can feel bigger. You are not required to absorb others' unprocessed emotions as evidence of your compassion. Your job is to become more fully yourself, to trust your perceptions even when they're inconvenient, to honor your needs even when they disappoint others, and to create a life that reflects your values rather than others' expectations. This is the path of psychological sovereignty, the journey toward a life where you can finally stop performing and start being. Sleep well, knowing that your sensitivity is a superpower, your boundaries are acts of love, and your commitment to authenticity is changing the world one honest conversation at a time. The hidden hatred that exists around us loses its power when we stop hiding from our own wisdom about who and what truly serves our highest good. And in the comments below, tell me, where are you tuning in from tonight? And what's one boundary you're ready to set in service of your own psychological sovereignty? I'll be reading, and I suspect many of you will find that you're not as alone in this work as you might think. Sweet dreams, fellow travelers. May you wake up tomorrow a little more committed to being exactly who you are, regardless of who thinks you should be someone else.